I'm John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. Today we're going to be talking about how myth and history intersect, a rather complex topic, to be honest. The Torah is traditionally supposedly written by Moses, and Moses supposedly lives around 1300 BCE, plus or minus a century or so. The question is there anything like the Torah being written in the second millennium BCE? The Torah is an ostensibly historical document, a history, combining historical events with really interesting narrative episodes and dialogue. Was there an editor recording all the things that Abraham said to his wife, before they had Isaac? So the Torah reads as historical literature. Is there anything in the second millennium BCE that reads like that? And the answer is no, not really. And this tells us the Torah really is a product, a post-Mosaic product written in the first millennium BCE. What we do get in the second and third millennium BCE are, we get mostly economic documents. There are thousands of receipts and contracts, so much so that one of the theories of the origin of writing is for economic purposes. But we do get religious literature as well. This includes hymns, poems, mythological vignettes. Certainly do not read like the Torah. This would be something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you get mythological scenarios, monsters and giants and cosmic bulls, and the Nikia, the descent into the underworld. You have the Vedas in ancient India, which are religious rituals. And a lot of these mythological vignettes actually belong to seasonal liturgies. You do have wisdom texts. These are aphorisms, something like the book of Proverbs in the Bible, which existed in the Near East in the third and second millenniums BCE. Finally, we have political writing in this early period. This includes king's lists, victory stelas, even letters and communications between kingdoms. But in the end, nothing like the literary Torah. So this certainly does date our text to, again, middle of the first millennium BCE is the safest bet. Today we're going to look at actually a victory scene, a victory stela, but in this case it's a victory scene carved on an Egyptian temple wall about one of probably the best attested to historical battle in history. And we're going to see how the Egyptians combined mythological worldviews with historical content. And this might help us understand how in the second millennium BCE, and I've chosen this victory scene because it is actually written contemporary with Moses, 13th century BCE. And we're going to take this and perhaps this will illuminate how actually a character like Moses would have written as opposed to what we have in the Torah. So let's begin. Here we are at the Temple of Karnak in Luxor, Egypt. I was there 4 years ago, and took several pictures. I'm just going to show you some shots just so you can get a feel for this place. This is one of the most magnificent temples that survived from the ancient world. If you ever get a chance to go, I suggest you go. Here's a picture of the temple complex in the very early 1900s, like 1914 or 1917. You can see it has actually, this is a man-made lake for the temple. There are actually a series of temples built here. This was not all built at one time. It was built over centuries, added to by different pharaohs. Ramses II builds the Temple of Amun, this first pylon gate we're going to take a very close look at. This is the backside, and it's just a sprawling metropolis of stone. It goes on and on with obelisks. Most of the obelisks have been removed, of course, and the temple isn't anywhere where it used to be. Still, as you go through it, the majesty of it is just it's incomparable. I'm using a 10 millimeter wide angle lens, and my shots aren't doing any justice to the scope and to the majesty of the place. If you go try to be there in the evening at night, they light it up, and it really is quite spectacular. Here's a colonnade in a courtyard. I am there about 12 days before the summer solstice. I have to be back in Utah to do some time-lapse filming in my petroglyph studies for summer solstice. But still, here's the sunset, and I'm here at this the first pylon gate, and I am starting to think that 12 days from now, where's that summer solstice sun going to set? Is it going to be lined up with this pylon? That got me really interested, so I went home, did some research, and sure enough, the Temple of the Moon is astronomically aligned to the summer solstice sunrise and sunset. Here is the procession of sphinxes out in front of that first pylon gate. Very impressive. And here is that first pylon gate. You can see that there is writing and there figures here. This is actually a victory scene carved on both these pylons of the gate, and they're heavily eroded. Here's a close-up. You can see a chariot running into a disarray of opposing enemy. There's lots of hieroglyphic text on it. And here is essentially the main scenes on each of these pylons. I've superimposed them. And it turns out, just like the temple itself is astronomically aligned, we're going to quickly learn that these scenes are mythologically aligned. The entire thing, the entire structure and production of it has a logic and a purpose. And what's carved on the west panel is meant to be on the west. What's carved on the east panel is meant to be in the east, because if it's mythologically aligned, it's also astronomically aligned. Well, what is going on here? What is this scene? Let's talk about it. The scene is describing the victory at the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh is a city near the Orontes River in the northern Levant. In 1274 BCE, the Egyptians and the Hittites met there at a great battle. There are writing resources that document this battle from both sides. The Hittites record it, the Egyptians record it. Both sides claim victory. And both sides say that there were thousands of chariots, up to 5,000 chariots that met in battle. If that's true, it's the largest chariot battle in history, perhaps, ever, right? So, of course, the Egyptians claim that Ramses was victorious, though the battle appears to have been a draw. What we do know about the battle is that the Egyptians had 3 or 4 divisions, and one of the divisions got cut off, and the Hittites descended upon it, and it looked like it was going to be a slaughter, and this would have been, this would have been a catastrophe. This would have caused the Egyptians to lose. And according to our documents, the writing, Ramses leads another division, a chariot division, in to save the division that is cut off, and apparently he does, and he beats back the Hittites. And this is what he claims as the great victory, and when he returns home, he's certainly hailed as, a god king who saved Egypt. Here we are back at this pylon gate. Here in the west, We see Ramses seated on his throne. We'll go into that shortly. And he, as he charges into the Hittite horde, interestingly enough, at nighttime, Ramses finds himself alone. We have this text here written: "No officer was with me, no charioteer, no soldiers of the army, no shield bearer. My infantry, my chariotry yielded before them. Not one of them stood firm to fight with them." So Ramses is all alone, facing 1,000 chariots and 10,000 Hittite soldiers. And of course, the odds are impossible. This is like Samson slaying 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of an ass. It's utterly impossible. And yet it is done. And here on the east panel, we see Ramses, larger than life, charging in and dismantling the Hittite army and becoming victorious. And so Ramses here is depicted as a god king, and that no army can face him. He's transcendent to the human realm. For the longest time, and even today, Egyptologists and scholars have simply chalked this up to so many victory scenes in the ancient world as a radical piece of political propaganda. Ramses is declaring himself the god king and victorious over all his enemies, and no one can defeat him. Well, it is a radical piece of propaganda. It's a radical piece of political propaganda that has an internal logic. And it wasn't until the early 1900s when a French researcher and Egyptologist named Schwaller de Lubix surveyed the entire temple complex when he realized that something else was going on in this victory scene that he thought was very curious indeed. So we will pursue his line of thinking. Here we are on the west panel. Here we have Pharaoh Ramses II seated on the throne facing west. And in front of him are 6 chariots that are charging in to the Hittite army, which is depicted at the top and bottom registers. He is west-facing. There is the charioteers. Then he is depicted larger than life, facing east. He's larger than before, and he's superimposed over the west-facing. And here he has priests giving alms and offerings and prayers. And at this point in the nighttime of the battle, we read, actually, the previous panel, Pharaoh is alone. He's all alone, and he's facing the enemy horde. And he actually prays to Ammon, the sun god, and he says, "I call to you, my father Ammon. I am among a host of strangers. All countries are arrayed against me. I am alone. There's none with me." Now, what Schwaller de Lubix noted was that the Egyptian day actually began at 6 p.m. And if each one of these chariots were an hour of the day, by the time Ramses meets his enemy horde, he is therefore at midnight, at the dead center of the night, where he offers his prayer to Ammon. Well, it turns out that in the Egyptian journey of the dead, the deceased descends into the underworld, where he meets his greatest trial at midnight, at the heart of the underworld. And it's here, when the sun descends below the western horizon, where it starts to, if one can pass the trial of midnight, reascend to the east, so that it will reappear in the morning on the eastern horizon. And of course, here we have Pharaoh flipping, and his eastern position is now superimposed over his western position, where he is receiving alms and delivers his prayer. This is the reversal of the sun in the underworld, where he is all alone facing his enemy horde up till the hour of midnight, and yet is now facing eastward, ready for his eastward ascent with the sun. And sure enough, on the eastern panel, this is what we find. And the text actually says, Amun responds to Ramses prayers and declares forward, I am with you, I, your father, my hand is with you. I prevail over 100,000 men. I am Lord of victory, lover of valor. And then Ramses, sure enough, rises with the sun and defeats the entire Hittite horde. And the text reads, I was like Ray when he rises at dawn. My rays, they burned the rebels' bodies. Thereupon they stood at a distance, kissing the ground before me. So, on the eastern panel, Ramses, larger than life, charges into battle with the rising sun because he is the rising sun. He has re-emerged out of the underworld and is victorious over all his enemies. What Schwaller de Lubicz noted was this entire victory scene was analogized with the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The deceased descends into the underworld, where he faces a series of trials. Very often at the hour of midnight, he is alone. And this is where he meets, in some of the Egyptian texts, Apophis or other great monsters that he must overcome all alone. And if he can overcome it, then he starts arising out of the underworld through the hours, still meeting different obstacles, but with the help of the gods, the deceased rises up to become an Osiris and inherit his resurrection and eternal life. So Schwaller de Lubicz noted that the entire historical vignette there carved on the Temple of Karnak with the Battle of Kadesh is a historical vignette, but it's been analogized with the central cult cosmovision of the Egyptians. Ramses is now the Egyptian neophyte who descends into the underworld with the 6 chariots charging into the battle of the Hittites. He finds himself all alone at the midnight hour. He prays to Ammon for aid. He then turns around and faces east, begins his ascent, and with the rising sun, he conquers the Hittite army and is literally the sun god. So the entire historical vignette has been mythologized with not just a random, arbitrary mythological scenario, but with the central cult scenario of the Egyptian cosmovision. One overcame death through the process of descending into the underworld, defeating all the cosmic enemies, and rising up as a god. This is how Ramses defeated the Hittites. This brings us to a very existential realization when it comes to studying this material. Oral people mythologize history. Literate people historicize myth. What does that mean? Well, just think about it. Our modern histories have, thousands of footnotes. I've discussed this before. Many sources. Historians try to collate as many sources as possible in order to create the most plausible recreation of what happened in history. Oral peoples don't have any of this. What they have is, oral peoples aren't even concerned with recording history the way we are concerned with recording. In fact, the second truth to oral epistemology is, to oral people, truth is cosmic fact. To literate people, truth is historical fact. So here are the dichotomies, and they're dichotomies that we simply can't overcome. We historicize myth, and to us, truth is historical fact. All we want to know is what really happened. That's the truth. If it didn't happen, it's not true. The ancient world didn't think that way. What they wanted to know is what really happened as a cosmic fact, not as a historical fact. Right? So what does that mean? Well, in some sense, without writing, all your reference to truth are in what you see in nature. When a certain star rises on the horizon and at the same time a plant grows, the cosmic fact is this: the power in that star causes that plant to grow. There is a divine principle, a deity in that star, and that deity is also in this plant. They are connected, and therefore the god causes nature to grow, just as an example. And that's the truth they want to know. So, but this translates into historical events. How did Ramses defeat the Hittites? Well, they want to know the cosmic fact. They don't want to know, tell me what the sergeant did and what the captain did and what the general did and give me all the historical data. No, they want to know, how did the divine principles in the cosmos cause the outcome that happened? That's the truth. That's what they wanted to know. And so that's how they record their history. And in doing that, they're mythologizing their history, because they are going to talk about how the divine principles of the cosmos and of the gods helped history unfold, right? And this is what we get in the victory scene at Karnak. We get Ramses defeating the entire Hittite army by himself, but what we are really being told is the cosmic facts of the scenario. Ramses was wedded with Ammon, the sun god, and Ramses descended through the underworld to obtain his eternal life, as we know he will in the afterlife. But this is how he won the battle. He descended against the enemy horde by himself, communed with the gods, aligned with Ammon-Re, rose to the horizon with the rising sun, and defeated the enemy. It was by collecting and analogizing himself with these divine principles that allowed him to defeat the Hittites. So the Egyptians, yes, it is political propaganda, but what they are telling us is their view of truth. And it's not historical, it's mythologized. It's entirely mythologized, but it's their view of truth. And this is the view in the 2nd millennium BCE. This is from Mircea Eliade, The Sacred and Profane. I thought I would read it. Quote, "But to relate a sacred history is equivalent to revealing a mystery. For the persons of the myth are not human beings, they are gods or culture heroes. And for this reason, their gesta constitutes mysteries. The myth, then, is the history of what took place in illo tempore, in the beginning. The recital of what the gods or the semi-divine beings did at the beginning of time. To tell a myth is to proclaim what happened ab origine. Myth is bound up with an ontology. It speaks only of realities, of what really happened, of what was fully manifested." All right, so that's academic speak. And what Eliade really is saying is myth is not telling us what happened historical, seen by historicals. Give me the facts and only the facts. Rather, myth is analogizing to the story archetypes. And very often it's the archetypes of the beginning. What happens in the beginning? Or what happens when the sun descends? How does it reascend? Right? This is what we're getting in this victory scene. So myth concerns itself with the primal events, the creation events, or turning events that help the cycles of the cosmos renew. And so when oral peoples tell their stories, they're really telling different versions of these archetypes. And so when they tell their histories, sure enough, they will mythologize those histories with these archetypes. To them, this is truth. To us, it's not truth. We don't think this way. They thought this way. So then the question is, what is the intersection between myth and history? It turns out the Battle of Kadesh was historical. Ramses II was historical. He's being depicted as a mythological hero, a god king, but he's a historical human being. And so if we didn't know all the history behind the Battle of Kadesh, it would be really easy to say, well, this person is just a mythologic figure. He didn't exist in history. But that's not the case. Myth often contains historical content. And we have to admit that the Iliad of Homer, for example, relating the war between the Trojans and the Greeks, is most likely a historical episode of a great battle between the Trojans and the Greeks, and that the heroes Agamemnon and Priam and Achilles and the characters related, most of them are probably historical people, most likely historical people. The historical content is synthesized with cosmological and ritual patterns. This is what we just saw on the wall of Karnak. Ramses' battle with the Hittites was synthesized with cosmological and ritual patterns. So what does this mean? Was Troy historical? Well, most scholars believe it was. Was Gilgamesh historical? Well, most scholars believe he was. How about King Arthur? So this is really interesting because scholars are really split on this. I think most scholars actually think King Arthur is just legend. And more, most biblical scholars think Moses and Abraham are just legends, mythological vignettes that are not historical. I tend to believe that King Arthur is historical and that Moses and Abraham are also historical. But by the time we get their stories, they've been entirely mythologized, and then they're written down, they're literatized, right? And so the transmission of the story through orality, through ritual, through cosmic archetypes into history and literature that we get in the Torah, all these changes are happening to the meaning. But does that mean that these historical figures were never historical? Well, there's no evidence that we could use to say that they are historical other than these texts. But people rarely invent history. And so I think from my own point of view, there is probably historical truth to most of these stories. That is some seed of truth. Fully sourced historical methodology is a modern invention. I talked about that. Only we now use all the footnotes and sources, or even think in this way that only truth is only what happened in history. People rarely fabricate history. They do rewrite it all the time. So, look, even today our histories are being rewritten. Yeah, it's quite amazing that when I was in elementary school, I was taught that the American founding fathers were demigods. By the time I got to college, I was taught they were all white colonialists and evil. Where is the truth? But history is being rewritten all the time. Where is the truth of history? And modern historians run into the same problems that all history runs into. Even modern histories eventually turn into ideological archetypal tales. And this is very often the case. Most people don't know history. They know archetypal tales of history. It's only until you sit down and dive into the history books and learn all the minutiae that you start realizing, oh my goodness, history is enormously complex and in some sense unknowable. And there's Blakenberg, I think is the historian's name, writes that we have so little data in the ancient world that it's so depressing unless you just choose to ignore it. Our histories of the ancient world are, even from modern methodologies, there's very little that we can know for certain. We can only deal in probabilities, and very often those probabilities are not a product of what actually happened in the ancient world. They're a product of modern biases, departmental politics, what scholars written the latest paper. I mean, this may have absolutely nothing to do with ancient history. So the bottom line is history as a topic is complex, but the intersections between myth and history are real. Oral peoples mythologize history. Literate peoples historicize myth. What will this tell us for our interpretation of the Bible?